The diner was alive with the small-town hum of clinking silverware, steaming coffee pots, and conversations that carried more gossip than substance. In the corner, by the window where the morning light struggled through dusty blinds, sat a man most people overlooked. His back was straight, his movements careful, but his presence was quiet enough that no one paid him much attention. To them, he was just another older man passing time over a cup of black coffee. But behind those calm, weathered eyes lay decades of sacrifice. His name was James Callahan, 71 years old, a decorated veteran who had once worn his country's uniform with pride. Now he wore a faded jacket and an old ball cap, stitched with a patch that only the sharpest eye would recognize. His medals, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, campaign ribbons from conflicts most young people couldn't even name, sat untouched in a wooden box at home, buried under a stack of newspapers. To James they weren't trophies. They were memories. Some glorious, some unbearable. He didn't need to wear them on his chest to remember. But what stung wasn't that he had put those years behind him. What stung was that the world seemed to have put him behind as well. The waitress passed by his table twice without noticing his empty cup. At the counter, two teenagers laughed loudly, scrolling through their phones, one muttering "old-timer," when James shuffled past them earlier. Near the door, a businessman glanced over James and immediately looked away, as though eye contact might be a burden. It wasn't cruelty. It was worse than that. It was indifference. James stirred his coffee, though there was nothing left to stir, and listened to the hum of voices around him. He had once led men through deserts and jungles, commanded respect in places where respect was life or death. Now he could sit in plain sight and be invisible. In moments like these, the questions always returned: was it worth it? Did anyone even remember? He thought of his friends, the ones who never came home. He thought of promises made in sandstorms and firefights, promises to never forget. And yet, here he was, living proof of how quickly memory fades. A mother walked in with her son, maybe 8 years old. The boy tugged at her sleeve, asking for pancakes. James smiled faintly at the sound, but the mother ushered the boy to a booth, never glancing his way. He wasn't bitter, not really. Just tired. Tired of being a shadow in a world that seemed to only celebrate noise and youth. Still, there was dignity in the way he carried himself. His shoulders were squared, his jaw set. He didn't demand recognition, didn't need applause. What he longed for was simpler: to be seen, to know that those years meant something to someone beyond himself. The diner clock ticked softly overhead. Outside, the rumble of motorcycles broke the monotony. A handful of Hell's Angels were pulling into the lot, engines snarling like thunder against the quiet morning. Heads turned at once. Conversations faltered. Even the waitress paused mid-pour. James didn't move. He'd seen tougher men, louder men, scarier men. He took a slow sip of his lukewarm coffee and set the cup back down. For the others, the sound of motorcycles meant trouble. For James, it was just another reminder. Respect in this world often went to those who demanded it, not those who had earned it quietly. And so he sat, unnoticed, as the door creaked open and the world shifted, though he didn't know it yet. The clatter of the diner faded into the background as James let his mind drift. It always happened this way: one small sound, one fleeting glance, and suddenly he was somewhere else entirely. He remembered the desert heat pressing down like a furnace, the metallic taste of dust in his mouth. He remembered the laughter of men packed shoulder to shoulder in the back of a transport truck, joking even as mortars rumbled in the distance. Camaraderie was a lifeline back then. A joke, a story from home, a shared can of rations, all of it stronger than fear. James had been their captain. He wore the weight of command like an anchor, but also like armor. Decisions he made saved lives. Others haunted him still. He could see the night patrol, the sudden flash of light, the shockwave that threw him into the dirt. He woke to ringing ears and a young soldier pulling him to safety, only to realize that boy never made it home. His name still burned on a memorial wall, etched in stone but alive in James's chest. In those days, respect wasn't given lightly, it was earned with sweat, with courage, with blood. And when he looked his men in the eye, he knew he had it. He was their leader, their shield, their steady hand in chaos. Then, as quickly as the memory surged, it slipped away. The clatter of plates and chatter of strangers dragged him back to the present. The diner, the indifference, the weight of silence. A group of college kids entered, laughing too loudly, bumping past his table without so much as a glance. One of them reached the counter just as the waitress returned. She bypassed James entirely, asking, "What can I get you boys?" while his empty cup sat untouched. He shifted in his seat, cleared his throat softly, but the sound was swallowed by laughter. The waitress didn't even look his way. Another man approached the counter, younger, well-dressed, clearly in a hurry. James had been standing up, waiting patiently, but the man slid in front of him without hesitation. He didn't apologize. He didn't even notice. James stepped back quietly, letting him take the place. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. But something inside him tightened. His mind whispered, "Once I was someone men followed into battle. Now I can't even hold my place in line at a diner." The question gnawed at him, the same question that haunted his sleepless nights. Was it worth it? Was it worth the years spent overseas, far from family, far from home? Was it worth the scars, the sleepless nights, the funerals of friends whose laughter still echoed in his ears? Was it worth giving everything only to return and feel like nothing? He looked down at his hands, steady but worn. These were the hands that once held maps and rifles, that once lifted men out of danger, that once saluted with pride. Now they trembled slightly as they lifted a coffee cup that no one cared to refill. The diner door jingled again. Another group entered, chatting, not even glancing his way. The young mother and her boy were finishing pancakes, the boy's laughter ringing louder than the quiet dignity at James's table. Invisible. That's what he was. Not despised, not mocked, just unseen. And in some ways that hurt worse. He sat back, listening to the low murmur of conversations around him. Every voice seemed to carry purpose, urgency, a sense of belonging. Meanwhile he was an echo. A man out of place, out of time. Yet, beneath the quiet exterior, the weight of injustice pressed heavy. Not the kind of justice you seek in a courtroom, but the silent justice of recognition. He had given his country everything and the world barely noticed. The motorcycle engines outside revved again, low thunder rolling across the small-town streets. The sound pulled him back to the present, sharpening the edges of his thoughts. He glanced toward the window where chrome gleamed under the morning sun. For now, though, the questions remained unanswered. And as James lowered his gaze, letting the chatter wash over him, the refrain echoed once more in his mind. Was it worth it? The first growl of engines rolled through the diner like distant thunder. Heads turned instinctively, forks paused mid-air. By the time the motorcycles pulled into the lot, the noise was a storm. Chrome flashed under the late morning sun, leather jackets glinted with patches, and boots crunched gravel as riders swung their legs down in practiced rhythm. The waitress froze mid-pour, eyes darting to the window. The businessman at the counter muttered something under his breath, shifting uncomfortably. A few locals whispered quickly, their voices hushed but sharp, "Hell's Angels." The name carried weight. Reputation preceded them. To the townspeople, bikers weren't symbols of loyalty or honor, they were danger wrapped in denim and leather, men who lived by rules the rest of the world didn't understand. Parents pulled their children closer. Conversations dulled to murmurs. All except one man. James Callahan sat at his corner table, unmoved. He didn't need to crane his neck to see them. The sound told him everything. Discipline in the engines, unity in the way they parked as a pack, hierarchy in who led and who followed. He had seen the same patterns in convoys and platoons. Different uniform, same brotherhood. But no one looked at James. The diner's eyes stayed glued to the rough-looking riders outside. The 71-year-old veteran remained just as invisible as before, even as the room thickened with unease. The door creaked open and the first biker stepped inside. His presence filled the space instantly, tall, broad-shouldered, beard trailing down his chest, a leather vest stitched with insignias that told his story to anyone who knew how to read them. Behind him, 3 more followed, boots heavy against the tile floor. The diner seemed to shrink. The waitress forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The college kids at the counter whispered nervously. The businessman checked his watch, pretending he had somewhere urgent to be. The bikers didn't speak much. They moved like a storm cloud rolling in, slow, deliberate, confident. Their laughter was low, edged with something that kept the locals stiff in their seats. James lowered his gaze to his coffee cup, still empty, still ignored. He wasn't afraid. Not of men like these. He'd known real fear and it didn't wear leather and chains. Still, he remained silent, steady, the quiet observer in a room alive with tension. Then it happened. As one of the bikers scanned the room, his eyes caught on James. At first it was nothing more than a glance. Then a double take. The man's gaze fixed on the faded patch stitched onto James's cap. Time seemed to stall for a beat. It was an old unit insignia, frayed, worn down by years of sun and sweat. To most people it was just an old piece of fabric. But to the right eyes it spoke volumes. The biker's expression shifted. The smirk faded, replaced by something unreadable. He slowed his steps, letting his boots echo deliberately against the tile. The diner went silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. Coffee cups were lowered. All eyes turned, following the biker's movement as he walked away from his group and straight toward the veteran in the corner. James didn't flinch. He met the man's eyes with the same calm steadiness he had carried through firefights and patrols. But inside, a quiet question stirred. What now? Would this man mock him? Dismiss him? Challenge him in front of everyone? That was what the room expected. The Hells Angels were notorious for intimidation, for pushing boundaries. To the locals, the scene unfolding was a confrontation waiting to ignite. The biker stopped at James's table. The silence was so heavy it pressed against the walls. The college kids held their breath. The waitress stood frozen, pot of coffee trembling in her hand. The biker looked down at James, eyes flicking once more to the cap. For a moment he said nothing. The tension stretched, sharp as wire. And in that pause, the contrast was stark. One man carried an intimidating reputation like a weapon, the other carried quiet humility like a shield. The room braced for conflict. But James only sat still, shoulders squared, gaze unbroken, his dignity intact. The biker stood over James's table, a wall of leather and steel, the diner holding its breath. The silence was so thick that even the hum of the refrigerator in the back seemed louder. James didn't move. He met the man's gaze calmly, the same way he had faced down uncertainty on battlefields long ago. Around him, the room braced for the moment to erupt, a harsh word, a shove, some kind of intimidation. That was the expectation. But instead, something unexpected happened. The biker's posture shifted. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted. Slowly, deliberately, he brought his hand to his forehead and held a crisp, steady salute. The room gasped. Forks clattered against plates. The college kids whispered in disbelief. The businessman froze, halfway through reaching for his wallet. Even the waitress, pot of coffee trembling in her hand, went perfectly still. James blinked, unsure if what he was seeing was real. But there was no mistaking it. This was no mockery, no taunt. It was respect, raw and unmistakable. The biker's voice, rough but steady, broke the silence. "Sir, we don't forget our own." The words carried weight, settling over the diner like a heavy blanket. Slowly, James noticed details he hadn't before. The small patch on the man's vest, half hidden under leather and denim. It was military too, newer, from a younger generation but part of the same brotherhood. James felt something stir in his chest, something that had been buried for years. Recognition. Connection. The acknowledgement he thought had vanished with time. The biker dropped the salute, but his eyes didn't waver. "You led the way before us. Don't think for a second it's forgotten." For the first time in years, James had no words. His throat tightened, and he could only nod, the weight of memory pressing heavy behind his eyes. He hadn't expected this, not from a stranger, not from a man the world judged as an outlaw. The room was still silent, but the tension had shifted. What moments ago felt like dread now hung with reverence. People who hadn't spared James a glance earlier now stared at him differently, as if suddenly seeing not just an old man in a diner, but a veteran, a man who had carried more than most could imagine. In that instant, James wasn't invisible anymore. The biker's salute lingered in the silence, heavy and unshakable. And then, one by one, the others followed. The second biker, younger, with tattoos winding down his arms, removed his cap and pressed it to his chest. Another stood straighter, hand over heart, head bowed in quiet respect. Within seconds, the group that had entered like a storm now stood united in honor, their presence transformed from menace to tribute. The diner's air shifted. What had moments before felt tense and uneasy now carried something different, reverence. Yet the locals struggled to keep up with the turn. The businessman at the counter, who hadn't noticed James until now, shifted awkwardly in his seat. The college students who had laughed earlier were wide-eyed, their expressions caught somewhere between guilt and awe. Even the waitress, cheeks flushed, slowly set the coffee pot down as if realizing her small neglect carried a greater weight than she'd intended. Near the booth by the window, the young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, why are they saluting that man?" His mother hesitated. Her voice was soft but carried across the diner in the stillness. "Because he's a soldier, sweetheart. He served our country." The boy blinked, eyes widening. "Like a hero?" The mother nodded, her face suddenly serious. "Yes, exactly like a hero." James lowered his gaze, uncomfortable under the weight of so many stares. He hadn't asked for this moment, hadn't sought recognition. His voice, quiet but firm, broke through the silence. "I was just doing my duty." The words hung there, simple and unadorned, cutting sharper than any speech could have. Duty. That was all it had ever been to him, not glory, not pride, just obligation. And yet, the humility in his tone only deepened the respect in the room. The bikers nodded, one of them murmuring, "That's what makes it mean something." For the locals, the moment was uncomfortable, almost chastising. They had looked past him, brushed him aside, reduced him to just another old man in a booth. And now, they were forced to confront the truth. He had carried burdens none of them could imagine, and they had missed it. The boy's voice rose again, curious and innocent. "Does that mean we should thank him?" This time his mother didn't hesitate. She stood, gently guiding her son's hand as they approached the table. The boy, small and uncertain, looked up at James. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice trembling. James's weathered face softened, the lines around his eyes deepening as he managed a faint smile. He reached out, steadying the boy's small hand in his. "You're welcome, son." Around the diner, others shifted, ashamed but moved. Some nodded respectfully, others lowered their heads. Recognition had come, but not from where they expected, not from the polished businessman, not from the everyday neighbors, but from men the town judged harshly and a child who spoke truth without pretense. And though the air was thick with emotion, the moment didn't resolve neatly. Respect had been shown, yes. But for the locals, the sting of their earlier indifference lingered. The gap remained, not yet closed, not yet complete. The room stayed hushed, each person carrying their own silent reflection, as James sat quietly in the middle of it all. The salute ended, but the weight of it lingered. Then the lead biker leaned forward, his gravelly voice filling the silence. "Brother, you shouldn't be sitting alone. Come join us." James blinked, caught off guard. For years, he had lived on the margins of conversations, invisible in corners. Now this towering figure, a man who carried both fear and respect in equal measure, was inviting him to the center. He shook his head politely. "I'm fine right here." But the biker leader wasn't having it. He gestured toward the long table where the rest of his group sat, their leather vests creased but their eyes attentive. "No, sir. Men like you don't sit in shadows. Not today. Come sit with us." The entire diner watched as James slowly rose, each movement deliberate as though the air itself was heavy. He followed the biker to the table, the sound of his boots echoing softly against the tile. When he sat, the others leaned in, not with arrogance but with reverence. At first he resisted. Old habits kept his stories locked away, hidden behind the quiet walls he'd built. But the bikers pressed gently, asking questions only those who understood service could ask. One mentioned his own deployments, another talked about nights on foreign soil. Gradually James opened up. He spoke of the heat, the long marches, the bonds forged in places where death was always a breath away. He spoke of the men he led, the ones who made him laugh when laughter seemed impossible, and the ones he carried home only in memory. His voice trembled at times, but his words carried a weight that silenced even the rowdiest of bikers. Around the diner, something shifted. The locals who had ignored him earlier now leaned closer, some openly listening, others pretending to sip coffee while hanging on every word. The college students stopped whispering. The businessman sat back, shame softening into quiet respect. Even the waitress who had once passed him by, stood still in the corner, her eyes glistening. For the first time in years, James felt what he thought had been lost forever. His voice mattered. His stories mattered. His presence mattered. The boy who had thanked him earlier sat cross-legged near the table, listening with wide eyes. Every word was a lesson, every pause a history deeper than any textbook could teach. Finally, James fell silent. His stories, once locked away, had poured out until he had nothing left to add. He sat back, the weight both lifted and pressed heavier in his chest. The biker leader reached across the table, his calloused hand gripping James's firmly. His voice was steady, but it carried a rough edge of emotion. "You're never forgotten, brother. Not by us." The words cut through James like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. They weren't flowery, weren't grand, but they were real. And for James that was enough. The diner sat in reverent silence. What had begun as an ordinary morning had become something extraordinary. A man once invisible now stood taller in the eyes of everyone present. James didn't smile broadly, didn't bask in the moment. Humility was too deep in his bones for that. But his eyes softened, and for the first time in years, his heart carried a quiet peace. The sun hung low on the horizon as James stepped out of the diner. The air was cooler now, the engines of the bikers fading into the distance like a memory already slipping into legend. The street was quiet again, the kind of small-town quiet that usually made him feel invisible. But today it felt different. He walked slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, each step carrying less weight than the one before. For years, his shoulders had carried the burden of silence, the ache of being overlooked. Now there was a lightness not from applause or public honor but from something simpler. From being seen. From being recognized if only for a moment for what he had given. As the setting sun cast long shadows on the sidewalk, James allowed himself a small smile. Not a wide grin, not the laughter of youth, but the kind of quiet smile that comes from peace settling in the soul. His thoughts lingered on the bikers, men the town feared, men judged for their appearance and reputation. Yet they had carried honor where others had not. They had reminded him and everyone watching that respect doesn't always come from where you expect it. Sometimes, it arrives in leather and steel from those society misunderstands. The faces of the locals flickered in his mind. The businessman, the students, the waitress, all of them forced to reckon with what they had overlooked. And the boy, wide-eyed and curious, who had asked the question adults were too afraid to ask, "Should we thank him?" That single act, so pure, had spoken louder than any speech. James paused at the corner, looking toward the horizon where the sky blazed orange and red. His voice echoed only in his thoughts, but it carried a message meant for anyone willing to hear. Sometimes those judged harshest by society carry the deepest honor. And sometimes, it takes one act of recognition to remind us of the value of every sacrifice. With that, he kept walking, disappearing into the glow of twilight. No parade, no applause, no medals pinned on his chest, just the quiet dignity of a man who finally knew he was not forgotten. And for the first time in years that was enough.